Billionaire Sheikh asked Maid's daughter to play chess as a test, unaware she was a child genius. Checkmate. Already? The words sliced through the hushed banquet hall like a blade. No one could believe it had come from the lips of a child. 10-year-old Abby Miller, the maid's daughter, whose tiny hand now hovered above the chessboard, her last move shimmering with brilliance beneath the golden chandeliers of Sheikh Khaled al-Jamili's palace. Just moments earlier, the billionaire sheikh had commanded the room. Draped in a white kandura stitched with gold thread, his bejeweled fingers resting arrogantly on the arm of his chair, he had promised the guests a spectacle, to humiliate the servant who dared to mop his marble floors. Instead, her daughter had stepped forward. A girl with wide, steady eyes and braids tied neatly with a ribbon, facing the most powerful man in Dubai as though facing a schoolyard bully. The crowd had laughed at first. Cameras flashed. Laughter echoed against the gilded walls. But now the laughter had died, because in less than 30 minutes, the man worth billions, the patron of oil fields, resorts, and yachts, was staring at a trap he had not seen coming. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His queen was gone, his king cornered. He had underestimated her, dismissed her as a child, a novelty, a distraction. Yet here he sat, paralyzed. Silence, then a murmur, then gasps, louder and louder. The mighty sheikh, undone by a servant's child? He tried to laugh it off, pushing the board away, but the move was undeniable. His king was trapped. He could not move. He could not win. And as the realization spread, so did the shame. For the first time, Khaled al-Jamili's power was not enough. His wealth could not buy back the lost game. His guests stared, some pitying, some amused, some already whispering to reporters. Abby sat still, her cheeks flushed, but her eyes calm, waiting for him to accept defeat. He did not. He stood, cape swirling, and stormed out, leaving the crowd in uproar. The question hung in the air like smoke. If a 10-year-old girl could topple him in a single game, what else could strip this billionaire of his throne? The Al-Jamili Palace was not merely a home. It was a kingdom carved into stone and glass. Rising from the edge of the Dubai desert like a mirage of impossible wealth, its towers glittered with imported marble, sapphire fountains, and chandeliers so heavy with crystal that even the air seemed to bow beneath their weight. Guests whispered it was a place where no wish went ungranted, except perhaps the wish for warmth. Inside, corridors stretched endlessly, their walls hung with priceless calligraphy and portraits of ancestors who had once ruled caravans across the shifting sands. At the center of it all sat Sheikh Khaled al-Jamili, the man who had transformed oil into an empire of hotels, resorts, and private banks. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an immaculately trimmed beard, flecked with silver. His eyes were sharp and dark, yet beneath their command lay something restless: boredom. Khaled was admired by many, feared by most, but loved by none. His power was spectacle: lavish yachts anchored in Monaco, horses bred to run faster than the wind, banquets that could feed 1,000 souls. Yet the silence that followed his laughter always betrayed him. When the guests went home, when the last violin faded, he was left alone with the echo of his own voice. Susan Miller knew this silence well. She was an American maid who had taken work in the palace after a bitter divorce, bringing her daughter Abby with her. Though her job was simple, polishing silver, arranging linens, ensuring the palace remained spotless, she moved like a shadow, never raising her eyes in the presence of power. The staff whispered that Susan had once been a nurse, but life had pushed her into servitude, and she accepted it quietly for the sake of her daughter. Abby, however, did not fit so easily into the mold of invisibility. She was small for her age, with hair the color of chestnuts and an intensity in her gaze that unsettled even the palace guards. When others her age ran and laughed, Abby sat cross-legged with books salvaged from the staff library, histories of wars, puzzles, and most often, chess manuals. She traced the diagrams carefully, her lips moving as though whispering to someone unseen. That someone was her great-grandfather, General Robert Miller, known in his day as Iron Wall Miller. He had taught her the game long before her family had fallen into hardship. A decorated strategist from the U.S. Army, he believed chess was not a pastime, but a mirror of life itself. "Every piece has its purpose, Abby," he would say, tapping the board with weathered fingers. "The pawn may look small, but it can cross the board and transform. Never forget, the ones people overlook often hold the greatest power." Those words stayed with her long after the old general passed away, and they would soon be tested in a palace where pawns like her were never meant to speak. On the night of the banquet, the palace transformed into a stage of dazzling extravagance. Guests arrived in fleets of limousines, their gowns shimmering with sequins, their tuxedos pressed to perfection. Gold-trimmed carpets stretched across the marble floors, leading into a hall where long tables overflowed with delicacies from every continent. Saffron lamb, caviar pyramids, fruits carved into sculptures of falcons and camels. Sheikh Khalid entered like a king claiming his throne. His presence silenced the orchestra mid-note. He carried himself with the assurance of a man who believed every soul in the room existed for his amusement. To prove it, he sought diversions. Some nights it was falconry. Other nights it was poetry duels. On this particular evening, he chose chess, a game he enjoyed not for the challenge, but for the performance of victory. "Bring me an opponent," he declared, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceilings. "Someone brave enough to fall before me." The crowd tittered. A few of his business associates chuckled knowingly. They had seen this spectacle before. The sheikh would select some hapless guest, trounce them in a display of superiority, and bask in the applause. His eyes drifted over the crowd before settling on Susan, who stood with the other servants at the edge of the room, tray in hand. "You," he said, pointing, "step forward. Tonight, you will entertain us." A hush fell over the hall. Susan's face paled. Her hands trembled so violently that crystal glasses rattled on the tray. "My lord, I cannot," she stammered. The guests laughed. The sheikh's lips curved into a cruel smile. "Do you fear the game, or do you fear me?" At that moment, Abby stepped out from behind her mother. Her voice was soft but steady. "I'll play." Heads turned. A ripple of shock moved through the guests. A child against Khalid? The notion was absurd, even insulting. Yet Abby stood unwavering, her small hands clasped before her, her gaze locked on the sheikh's with quiet defiance. For a fleeting moment, something sparked in Khalid's eyes. Not fear, not respect, but curiosity. The room leaned in, sensing a storm about to break. Thus, the stage was set. A bored billionaire seeking amusement, a maid's daughter carrying the legacy of a forgotten general, and an audience hungry for spectacle. What no one knew, not even Abby herself, was that this single game would unravel reputations, shift power, and echo far beyond the palace walls. The hall erupted in laughter the moment Abby's words reached the gilded rafters. "A child?" one man scoffed, his jeweled cufflinks glittering as he clutched his wineglass. "Sheikh Khaled will finish her in 3 moves." Another guffawed, earning approving nods from his circle of associates. The orchestra struck a mocking note, a playful trill that turned the challenge into a circus act. Abby's small figure seemed swallowed by the enormity of the room, her plain cotton dress and neatly braided hair a stark contrast to the silk gowns and tailored suits surrounding her. Her mother clutched her wrist. "Abby, please, don't." Susan's voice cracked, her fear of consequences outweighing everything else. She had seen what happened when the Sheikh's temper soured. Staff were dismissed without warning, cast out into the desert night with no pay, no protection. But Abby gently shook her mother's hand free. "It's okay, Mama." She stepped toward the board with the quiet dignity of someone far older than her years. Sheikh Khaled leaned back in his carved throne-like chair, stroking his beard with deliberate slowness. "Very well," he said, his deep voice resonating across the chamber. "If the maid's daughter wishes to taste humiliation, who am I to deny her? Sit, child." A servant hurried to pull out the opposing chair. Abby climbed onto it, her legs barely reaching the floor. She placed her hands on the edge of the board, studying the arrangement of polished ebony and ivory pieces. Her expression was calm, though her heart thudded in her chest. Khaled opened with flair, sliding a pawn forward with theatrical flourish. "Observe, guests. Even in play, the king advances first." His words drew chuckles from the audience. Abby responded with quiet precision, advancing her own pawn. No commentary, no fanfare. The game unfolded quickly, Khaled narrating each move as though lecturing a crowd of students. The knight leaps forward. See how it controls the field? Pay attention, child. This is what dominance looks like. "Careful," Abby murmured, almost inaudibly as she countered with her bishop. "What was that?" Khaled raised an eyebrow. "Careful," she repeated, her voice clear this time. The crowd roared with laughter. "She warns him! How precious!" someone shouted. "Like a kitten hissing at a lion." Susan stood frozen at the edge of the room, her nails digging into her palms. Every fiber of her wanted to pull her daughter away, yet she knew that stopping Abby now would bring even harsher ridicule. As the game pressed on, Khaled grew more flamboyant. He leaned across the board, gesturing to his pieces as if they were soldiers in a glorious parade. "See how easily I cut her defenses? A single thrust, and her little army collapses." Abby quietly moved a pawn, her eyes never leaving the board. He countered with a rook. "Ah, the fortress falls. A lesson, child. Pawns exist to be sacrificed." More laughter, a ripple of agreement. Business partners slapped each other's backs, emboldened by their master's dominance. For them, this was more than entertainment. It was validation that power, wealth, and arrogance were invincible. But beneath the laughter, Abby heard something else. A voice, deep and steady, echoing from memory. "Every piece has its purpose, Abby. Never underestimate the overlooked." Her great-grandfather's lesson. Khaled pressed harder, his attack swift and aggressive, clearly aiming for a quick checkmate to end the spectacle. He sacrificed a knight, then a pawn, forcing Abby into what seemed like retreat. "Ah, desperation already," he mocked, spreading his arms as though to invite applause. the child learns the truth. The board, like the world, belongs to those bold enough to take. Bold isn't the same as reckless, Abby said softly. This time, the laughter faltered. Some guests leaned closer, their curiosity piqued by the girl's calm tone. Khaled's eyes narrowed. For the first time, he felt a faint sting, not of defeat, but of being challenged in front of his court. His pride bristled. "Do you imply I do not know this game?" Abby's response was silence. She moved her queen into position, her expression unreadable. The room shifted. The move was sharp, deliberate, and suddenly Khaled's attack line seemed less secure. His brows furrowed as he studied the board. A murmur spread among the crowd, but pride would not allow him to acknowledge it. He slammed down his rook. "There, now let us see how long you last." The applause was loud but hollow. Beneath it, whispers began. "She's holding her ground. The girl is not afraid." And yet, at that very moment, Susan felt the deepest sting of betrayal, not from her daughter, but from the guests themselves. Their laughter was cruel, their mockery merciless. Not one soul in the glittering hall had offered kindness. Not one had urged the sheikh to show mercy. In their eyes, mother and daughter were not people, only pawns in Khaled's game of spectacle. Abby moved another piece. A trap was forming, quiet, invisible to most, but real. Khaled didn't see it, not yet. But the first crack in his arrogance had appeared. The white marble board blurred before Abby's eyes. For a fleeting moment, the glittering banquet hall dissolved into memory. The laughter, the silk gowns, the looming figure of Sheikh Khaled, they all faded, replaced by the warm scent of tobacco and old books in a wooden cabin half a world away. She was 5 years old again, perched on a stool far too big for her, watching her great-grandfather's weathered hands arrange chess pieces with soldierly precision. General Robert Ironwall Miller was a legend in the family. To the world, he was a retired strategist who had led men through the worst winters of war, earning medals and titles. To Abby, he was simply Grandpa Bob, the man with the gravelly voice who carried her on his shoulders and told stories by the fire. His frame was bent with age, but his mind was sharper than any blade. "Look closely, Abby," he would say, sliding a pawn forward. "This one's small, everyone mocks it, but it can cross the whole board if it's patient. Never laugh at a pawn." "Why?" she'd ask, her small hands barely able to wrap around a knight. "Because the moment you laugh at someone, you stop seeing them clearly, and when you stop seeing, you lose." They played for hours on end. At first, Abby lost every game. She cried, frustrated at her defeats. But the old general never coddled her. "Losing is a gift," he told her. "Each loss is a lesson wrapped in pain. If you unwrap it, you'll grow stronger than the man who always wins." By 6, she had begun to see the board differently. She no longer rushed her pieces, but studied the field as if she could see 10 moves ahead. By 7, she was defeating neighbors, family friends, even her own mother, who never quite understood the game but smiled at her daughter's seriousness. Ironwall Miller's lessons went beyond chess. On stormy nights, when thunder rattled the windows, he spoke of courage. "Fear doesn't go away, Abby. You just learn to walk through it. The bravest soldier is never the one who feels nothing. It's the one who shakes, but still takes the step." When her parents divorced, the lessons became lifelines. Susan wept quietly in her bedroom, believing Abby was asleep. But the little girl would tiptoe into the old general's study, where the board always sat waiting. "They think money is the king," he once muttered, watching Abby sacrifice a bishop with startling foresight. "But money is just a piece. It cannot shield you. Only wisdom and courage can." Those words carved themselves into her soul. Then came the hardest lesson of all. The winter Abby turned 8, Iron Wall Miller fell ill. Pneumonia struck with merciless speed, and the once unshakable general weakened by the day. Abby sat by his bedside, arranging chess pieces on a small board to keep him company. "Don't cry, Abby," he rasped, seeing her eyes glisten. "Even kings fall. But the game lives on through you." She tried to stay strong, but when he coughed, racked, and violent, she clutched his hand and whispered, "Promise me you won't leave." The general gave her a sad smile. "I can't promise that, but I promise this. You will never be alone. Every time you sit at a board, I'll be there. Every pawn you move, every queen you sacrifice, I'll be beside you." 3 days later, he was gone. Abby buried her grief in silence. She played alone, whispering her moves aloud as if he could still hear them. At school, children mocked her for being quiet, for carrying around a battered chess manual instead of a tablet. They called her the Maid's weirdo kid. She never answered. Instead, she opened her notebook and replayed the battles she'd studied with Iron Wall Miller, each page a dialogue with a man no longer there. By the time Susan accepted work in Dubai, Abby's identity had already been forged. She boarded the plane not as a helpless child, but as a strategist in miniature, disciplined, thoughtful, guided by an invisible general who lived on in her memory. And now, sitting beneath the chandeliers of Khaled's palace, she felt him again. His presence was in the steady rhythm of her breath, in the clarity of her vision. The Sheikh's booming voice faded, replaced by her great-grandfather's quiet murmur. "See beyond the arrogance, Abby. Every fortress has a crack. Every king is just a man." She blinked, and the banquet hall sharpened back into focus. The mocking faces returned. The jeweled laughter cut at her ears. But inside, she was back at that old wooden table, facing her mentor across the battlefield of 64 squares. Her hands no longer trembled. The fear in her chest turned to steel. The Sheikh thought she was a pawn. The guests believed she was a joke. But Abby knew the truth. Pawns could cross the board. Pawns could transform. And tonight, she would prove it. The hall had grown too loud. Laughter swirled, wine glasses clinked, and the orchestra plucked mocking notes to punctuate every boast Sheikh Khaled made. For the guests, it was still entertainment. For Susan, it was agony. She stood frozen, hands pressed to her lips, praying her daughter would not be crushed beneath this tidal wave of ridicule. But Abby sat motionless. Her brown eyes scanned the board, her small hands steady. She didn't look at the Sheikh or the crowd or even her mother. She looked only at the game. Khaled slammed down a bishop with exaggerated force, scattering the pieces slightly. "Check," he declared, his voice booming like a war drum. The guests erupted in applause, convinced the end was near. Abby leaned forward, her braid falling over her shoulder, and gently nudged a pawn into place. The move was so quiet, so unremarkable, that the room hardly noticed. But Khaled did. His smirk faltered. The bishop he had so proudly placed now looked cornered. A murmur rippled through the front rows. Someone whispered, "She's holding him off." Another said, "No, she's turning it back." Khaled waved a hand dismissively, though his eyes narrowed. A child's trick, nothing more. He countered with a rook, his movements growing less theatrical, more hurried. Abby answered with her queen, sliding it across the board with deliberate grace. The hall fell quieter this time. No orchestra jab, no drunken cheer, just the soft scrape of ivory on marble. Khaled froze. His king's position was suddenly vulnerable, boxed in on three sides. The trap wasn't complete, but for the first time, he saw the shadow of it forming. The silence grew heavy. Even the guests could feel the shift. Their smiles wavered, their laughter thinned. Khaled tried to reclaim control. He leaned forward, fixing Abby with a glare meant to intimidate. "Do you think this is a game you can win, little girl?" Finally, Abby looked up. Her voice, soft yet unwavering, cut through the hall like a blade. "It isn't about winning, it's about seeing clearly." The words struck harder than any move. The crowd inhaled sharply, stunned that a servant's child would dare speak to the sheikh this way. Even Susan's breath caught. Khaled chuckled, but it was forced. "Big words for a pawn." Abby returned her gaze to the board. "Every piece has a purpose," she said, almost as if reciting scripture. Then, with a small push, she advanced another pawn, an unassuming move that tightened the noose around his position. This time, the murmurs swelled louder than the laughter. Guests leaned over each other, whispering frantically. Some pointed at the board. Others simply stared at Khaled, waiting to see if he would acknowledge the danger. The sheikh's jaw clenched. His hand hovered over the pieces, uncertain for the first time. Pride urged him to crush her quickly, but instinct whispered caution. And instinct was louder now. For the first time, Sheikh Khaled looked not like a king holding court, but like a man facing something he could not control. The laughter had died. The music had stopped. The only sound left was the scrape of a child's next move. The storm had begun. A hush blanketed the banquet hall, as if the chandeliers themselves held their breath. What began as a farce, a child playing against the great sheikh, was no longer entertainment. The laughter had drained away, replaced by a taut silence that crackled like a storm about to break. Khaled's hand hovered above his rook. His movements, once theatrical, were now sharp, clipped, betrayed by the faint tremor of uncertainty. Across from him, Abby sat still as stone, her small frame radiating a calm that unsettled even the boldest guests. He pushed the rook forward, a defensive move. The crowd shifted in their seats. Defensive? Khaled al-Jamili, the man who had devoured rivals and conquered empires, retreating before a servant's child? Abby answered instantly. Her knight leapt across the board, snapping into position with surgical precision. The move was so seamless, so inevitable, that a gasp rose from the first row. "She planned that," someone whispered. "No, she couldn't have," came the disbelieving reply. But Khaled saw it now. She had. His queen was trapped, his rook weakened, his king's escape narrowed. Panic flickered across his features, quickly masked by a forced smirk. "Clever," he said, voice tight. "But cleverness without strength is nothing." He advanced his queen aggressively, lunging for Abby's defenses. The crowd leaned forward, hopeful that the sheikh might yet crush the insolence before him. But Abby remained composed. She sacrificed a bishop, sliding it into the queen's path. Gasps erupted. Why would she throw away such a valuable piece? Khaled's smirk returned as he snatched it up. "Foolish child," he murmured. Abby didn't flinch. Her next move was immediate, as though she had been waiting for this all along. Her rook glided across the board, cutting off the queen's retreat. Khaled's smirk evaporated. It was a trap. Her bishop hadn't been lost. It had been bait, Now the Sheikh's queen stood exposed, unable to retreat without leaving the king naked. The audience erupted, not in laughter this time, but in gasps of astonishment. "She baited him," someone exclaimed, "like a general luring an enemy into ambush." Khaled's face darkened. A sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. His hand shook as he captured another pawn, trying to claw back control. But with every move, Abby tightened the net. Her pawns advanced with eerie coordination, her knights weaved like silent hunters, and her queen circled with patient inevitability. Each move was precise, measured, merciless, not reckless brilliance, but disciplined strategy. It was the ghost of Ironwall Miller at her side, whispering across decades, "Every fortress has a crack. Every king is just a man." The hall had transformed into an arena. The guests, once mocking, now leaned forward with rapt attention. Their jeweled fingers gripped the edges of their seats. Their eyes darted between the child and the sheikh, unable to believe what they were witnessing. And then it happened. Abby slid her rook forward with a soft click. The board froze. Khaled's king was pinned against the edge. "Check," she said quietly. The word reverberated through the chamber like thunder. Khaled's lips tightened. His eyes darted desperately across the board. He shifted his knight, blocking. Abby responded instantly, her queen slicing through the defense. "Check," she whispered again. The guests murmured, their voices rising like a wave. A few even clapped before stopping themselves, glancing nervously at Khaled. The sheikh's hands twitched. His empire of confidence crumbled. He made another move, reckless this time, sacrificing a rook to buy space. Abby's knight swept in. "Check." The word was no longer a whisper, but a steady drumbeat. Each repetition carved deeper into Khaled's pride. Sweat dripped down his temple. His once steady breath grew ragged. He was fighting not a child, but a storm, a force he could not contain. Susan stood frozen, tears brimming in her eyes, not of fear, but of awe. This was her daughter, the girl she had raised in silence, carrying the fire of her great-grandfather. At last, Khaled made his final desperate gamble. He lunged his queen forward, sacrificing her in a reckless attempt to break through Abby's defenses. The crowd gasped. Was this brilliance or madness? Abby's hand hovered. Her eyes softened, as though she saw beyond the moment, back to the wooden table where Ironwall Miller once sat. She moved her rook deliberately, drawing Khaled's queen into a false victory. He seized it eagerly, slamming the piece onto the board with triumph. At last! But in that instant, his king stood naked. Abby slid her queen into position. Her hand lingered for a heartbeat, then released. The word left her lips like a final bell tolling across the desert. Checkmate. The silence was deafening. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the hall erupted, not in laughter, but in thunderous applause. Guests leapt to their feet, clapping, shouting, some even cheering. Cameras flashed wildly, desperate to capture the image, a child toppling the billionaire sheikh in his own palace. Khaled's face drained of color, his lips parted, but no words came. The great lion of Dubai, the man whose voice could silence nations, sat mute before a 10-year-old girl. Slowly, Abby leaned back in her chair, her expression calm, almost gentle. She did not gloat, she did not smile. She simply folded her hands in her lap, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. Across the hall, Susan pressed her hands to her mouth, sobbing quietly. Her daughter had not just survived humiliation, she had turned it into triumph. And Khaled? He rose abruptly, his robe swirling around him, his jaw clenched in fury. He did not offer a handshake. He did not speak. He stormed out, leaving behind a hall filled with roaring applause, his throne of pride reduced to dust. In that moment, power shifted, not to Abby, she did not want it, but away from Khaled, away from arrogance, toward something deeper, respect, courage, dignity. The girl had not just won a game, she had shattered an illusion. The applause did not fade quickly. It swelled and surged like a tide, refusing to ebb. Even those who had laughed the loudest at Abby now clapped furiously, desperate to align themselves with the undeniable brilliance they had just witnessed. Sheikh Khaled did not return. His chair remained empty, a silent monument to his pride shattered. The palace guards shifted uneasily, unsure whether to follow their master or stay where the crowd's favor now burned. For the first time, the guests looked not at Khaled's absence, but at the child who had bested him. Cameras angled toward Abby. Socialites in diamond necklaces leaned forward, whispering, "Who is she?" A European businessman murmured, "I must sponsor her." A journalist thumbed furiously at his phone, already composing a headline that would travel faster than Khaled's jets. Billionaire Sheikh defeated by Maid's daughter in public chess match. Susan, trembling, rushed to her daughter's side. "Abby, we have to go," she whispered urgently, terrified of repercussions. But the crowd parted for them, no longer mocking, no longer cruel. People stepped aside with murmured admiration, some even bowing slightly as they passed. By the time they reached the palace gates, the world outside had already begun to shift. Clips of the match spread across social media. Hashtags multiplied in every language: child genius, Sheikh checkmate, cash power of a pawn. In hours, Khaled became the subject of ridicule across the globe. Memes plastered his image beside toppled kings, captions mocking his arrogance. Late-night hosts in London, New York, and Mumbai joked about his downfall. Stock analysts whispered that his empire looked weaker than ever because humiliation, even more than failure, erodes power. And yet, Abby did not revel in the chaos. Back in the quiet of their modest apartment, she simply set up the small wooden chessboard that had belonged to her great-grandfather. She replayed the game silently, her mother watching with a mixture of pride and fear. When Susan finally spoke, her voice cracked. "Why did you have to do it, Abby?" Abby placed a pawn on the board, her expression serene. "Because he thought I was nothing." Her words were not triumphant. They were simple, almost sorrowful. She had not sought fame or victory, only dignity. Meanwhile, in his palace, Khaled raged. He smashed a goblet against the marble floor, the shards scattering like his pride. His advisors begged him to spin the story, to reclaim control. But the damage was done. No wealth, no power, no spin could erase the image of a billionaire undone by a maid's daughter. The arrogant had fallen, and the world had seen it. A year later, the world had all but forgotten Sheikh Khaled's humiliation. His empire limped on. Wealth and power can mask many wounds, but the sting of that night never truly faded. His name remained tethered to one word whispered in boardrooms and banquets alike: checkmate. But for Abby, life had changed in ways far more profound. She and her mother no longer lived in the shadow of the palace. A full scholarship had been offered to Abby at a prestigious academy near Washington, D.C., and Susan had secured steady work in an office there. Their new life was not lavish, but it was stable, honest, and filled with the kind of peace Susan had prayed for. Every evening, after homework and chores, Abby returned to her grandfather's chessboard. She did not play for cameras or crowds, though the invitations still arrived. Tournaments, endorsements, interviews. Susan kept most of them unopened. Abby simply smiled and said, "No, Mama, I just want to play for us." In the quiet glow of their small apartment, she would set the pieces and begin. Each move was a conversation with the past, a way of keeping Ironwall Miller close. Sometimes, Susan would sit nearby with tea, watching her daughter's brow furrow in concentration. In those moments, the weight of all they had endured felt lighter. One spring evening, Abby paused mid-game and looked out the window. Beyond the glass, the city lights twinkled like a scattered chessboard of their own. Each window, each street lamp, a square waiting to be claimed. She whispered softly, almost as if to her absent great-grandfather, "I see it now. Every piece matters." Susan, hearing her, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "And so do you, sweetheart." Abby smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting both innocence and something far older. She was no longer just a child who had toppled a billionaire. She was proof that dignity, courage, and clarity could rise from the humblest places. Somewhere across the desert, Khaled might still rage against the memory of that night. But here, in the modest glow of a small apartment, Abby had already won something far greater. Not applause, not fame, but freedom. And as she lifted a pawn, holding it steady in the palm of her hand, she whispered one last line that seemed to echo across both the past and the future. "Even pawns can cross the board." The night grew still, carrying the words like a seed, a promise planted quietly, waiting to bloom.